They're described as tall, blue, bird-like beings here to guide humanity. But what if the Blue Avians aren't extraterrestrials at all? What if they're a psychological mirror, a modern myth perfectly designed for an age of distrust, algorithmic fear, and spiritual hunger? This is the story not of an alien race, but of the story itself. Who built it, why we believe it, and what it's truly built to do to your mind. In the modern UFO ecosystem, certain images recur with the persistence of a symbol rather than the logic of evidence. The Blue Avians, described as tall, humanoid, bird-like beings with blue feathers and a calm, almost priestly presence, are one of those images. They appear at the intersection of contemporary contactee narratives, New Age spirituality, internet-era myth-making, and a long human habit, turning the unknown into a figure that can be stared at, named, and moralized. The Blue Avians are not merely an alleged extraterrestrial race. In the stories told about them, they are a judgment on humanity, a warning about technology, a promise of rescue, and most importantly, a mirror. To understand the Blue Avians, the first step is to establish the ground rules of the investigation. This is not a story that rests on laboratory samples, publicly verifiable telemetry, or repeatable observation. It rests on testimony, interpretation, and an online cultural feedback loop in which a claim can become confirmed by sheer repetition. The Blue Avians are best approached as a body of claims. Who says they exist, what these witnesses say they do, where the story came from, how it evolves, and why it spreads. Some viewers will arrive wanting proof, others will arrive wanting the comfort of belief. The most honest approach is to treat the Blue Avians as a phenomenon that has two layers: the literal layer, what is being claimed, and the symbolic layer, what these claims do to the people who tell them and the communities that amplify them. The Blue Avians, as popularly described, are distinct from the broader category of avian beings that appear in scattered esoteric accounts. In the specific modern form, they are often depicted as a group with a spiritual or ethical agenda. They advise, restrict, or quarantine Earth. They warn of deception by other entities. They discourage reliance on advanced technology. They emphasize consciousness, intuition, and moral development. And they sometimes communicate telepathically rather than verbally. Their message, in many versions of the story, is less about star maps and more about spiritual alignment. That already tells us something. The Blue Avians arrive in the cultural imagination at a moment when UFO mythology is shifting from nuts and bolts craft and military secrecy towards something more metaphysical: consciousness, vibration, ascension, and hidden cosmic governance. If that sounds new, it isn't. Humans have been describing intermediaries between the mundane world and a larger hidden order for as long as stories have existed. What changes is the costume. In one era, the intermediary is an angel with wings and commands. In another, it is a fairy with rules and bargains. In the modern era, it becomes an extraterrestrial with a message that blends science fiction aesthetics with spiritual instruction. The Blue Avians, in that sense, sit comfortably inside a very old template. The non-human messenger whose authority comes from being other and whose moral force comes from being calm, distant, and uncorrupted. Long before anyone used the phrase Blue Avians, there were bird-human figures in religious art, mythology, and folk tradition. Ancient civilizations repeatedly imagined beings that combine human intelligence with avian qualities: wings, feathers, beaks, or bird-like heads. Sometimes these figures symbolize divinity or transcendence, creatures that move between earth and sky. Sometimes they symbolize death and the afterlife, because birds disappear into the horizon and return, as if they know routes humans cannot follow. Sometimes they symbolize protection. Sometimes they symbolize predation. The point is not to claim that ancient bird motifs are evidence of extraterrestrials. The point is that the human mind has long used avian imagery to represent the boundary between worlds. That boundary is where UFO mythology thrives. A UFO sighting is not just a report of an object, it is an encounter with ambiguity. You see something you cannot categorize, and your brain scrambles to build a narrative that restores order. If the narrative is advanced aircraft, the anxiety is political. If the narrative is aliens, the anxiety becomes existential. If the narrative is spiritual beings in disguise, the anxiety becomes moral. The Blue Avians belong to that last category. Their stories often insist the true battlefield is not national borders or even space. It is the human interior, belief, intention, fear, and what the storytellers call consciousness. This is one reason the Blue Avians have proven so adaptable online. A purely technological alien story demands technical details that can be checked and challenged: propulsion, materials, flight behavior, radar records. But a story about beings whose main message is spiritual can remain perpetually unfalsifiable. If you ask for evidence, the answer can be that evidence isn't the point, or that the beings avoid proof to preserve free will, or that only those ready will understand. The story becomes a self-sealing system. Skepticism is reinterpreted as spiritual immaturity. Doubt becomes proof of manipulation by darker forces, and lack of evidence is reframed as intentional benevolence. The core question, then, is not, are the Blue Avians real? Because in a strict evidentiary sense, we cannot establish that here. The more productive question is, why these beings, why this message, and why now? To answer, we need to map the modern origin of the Blue Avians narrative, identify the major claims associated with them, and examine how those claims slot into broader UFO subcultures, especially communities focused on secret space programs, occult cosmologies, and ascension narratives. The modern Blue Avian story rises in an environment where three forces converge. First, there is a growing public awareness of military secrecy, surveillance, and government disinformation, fertile soil for alternative explanations. Second, there is an explosion of online platforms where charismatic individuals can build an audience without institutional gatekeepers. Third, there is a spiritual marketplace where people seek meaning amid social acceleration, a desire for a cosmic frame that makes chaos feel intentional rather than random. In that environment, the Blue Avians are not just aliens. They are a promise that someone is watching, someone is ethical, and someone, finally, has the authority to say the confusion is part of a larger plan. But this promise comes with a price. When a narrative offers cosmic authority, it can also demand obedience. Trust the messenger, distrust critics, interpret uncertainty as a test. Many Blue Avian stories contain warnings about deception by other entities, warnings that can be useful, but can also function socially to isolate believers from outside influence. It is not uncommon in these communities to see a familiar pattern. Insiders are awake, outsiders are programmed. And disagreement is not just disagreement, it is evidence of manipulation. This is the terrain we're walking into. The Blue Avians, as a narrative, are not isolated. They are braided into a wider mythology of factions, alliances, spiritual hierarchies, and hidden interventions. In the next part, we will trace where the Blue Avian story becomes a distinct named thread, how it connects to earlier channeling traditions, how it borrows from older esoteric frameworks, and how it spreads through the feedback loop of modern UFO media. Where the Blue Avians come from. When a new alien race enters the UFO lexicon, it rarely appears fully formed. It emerges as a collage, assembled from earlier motifs, renamed, stabilized through repetition, and then retroactively treated as ancient truth. The Blue Avians follow that pattern. Their modern identity is shaped by overlapping streams, contactee literature, channeling culture, metaphysical cosmologies that predate the internet, and a media ecosystem that rewards the dramatic and the morally satisfying. Channeling, in particular, matters here, not because it proves anything, but because it provides a ready-made language for describing non-human intelligences as spiritual teachers rather than physical visitors. In channeling traditions, entities tend to speak in a certain register, calm, instructive, oriented toward moral lessons, and often critical of human fear. The message is usually about awakening, unity, and personal transformation. When modern UFO narratives shift from craft in the sky to beings managing a spiritual quarantine, they are moving into channeling territory whether they acknowledge it or not. The Blue Avians, in many accounts, communicate telepathically and emphasize spiritual development. This is structurally similar to earlier, higher beings narratives, where the details of biology or star systems are less important than the ethical posture. It's also psychologically attractive. If the beings are moral and advanced, then the universe is not indifferent. If they are watching, then history has an audience. If they are restricting interference, then the pain of the world can be reframed as a test rather than a meaningless accident. At the same time, the Blue Avians are often positioned as a faction within a larger cosmic politics. They are not alone. They are part of an alliance or council. They are opposed by other groups. They negotiate rules. They oversee timelines. This factional framing is common in contemporary UFO mythology because it allows infinite expansion. Any contradiction can be explained by different factions. Any new claim can be added as another group. The story becomes a universe, and the audience becomes a community living inside it. This is where modern insider narratives become important. In recent UFO subcultures, a recurring figure appears: the whistleblower, who claims access to secret programs and hidden history. The whistleblower is presented as both victim and chosen messenger, someone exposed to classified worlds who now risks everything to tell the truth. The credibility of the story rests less on evidence and more on the character arc: trauma, revelation, courage, and moral urgency. When the Blue Avians are introduced through this kind of narrative, their function changes. They are no longer just mystical teachers. They become validators of the whistleblower's journey, the beings who confirm his importance, instruct him, protect him, or assign him a role. In many popular retellings, Blue Avians appear as a corrective force. They are framed as higher density beings, spiritually advanced, often non-violent, and sometimes disappointed in humanity's choices. They may warn that other entities manipulate humans through fear and technology. They may discourage certain forms of artificial enhancement. They may insist that personal spiritual development is the real path out of conflict. In effect, they embody a kind of cosmic conscience, an externalized version of the moral voice that says, "You are powerful, but immature. You have intelligence, but not wisdom." This is an important pivot. The UFO question has always carried two competing impulses. One impulse is technological. What are the craft? How do they move? What is the propulsion? What is the engineering? The other impulse is moral. What does it mean that something else is here, and what does it say about us? Blue Avian narratives are overwhelmingly moral. They lean into the second impulse, and in doing so, they often sidestep the first. The being's agenda becomes the central focus, and physical evidence becomes secondary or irrelevant. The Blue Avians also inherit a set of familiar promises. They promise disclosure without chaos. They promise protection without tyranny. They promise transformation without requiring institutional change. This is not trivial. Stories that place salvation in external agencies, whether angels, aliens, or hidden councils, can soothe the stress of living in complex systems that individuals cannot control. The Blue Avians, in many versions, offer a comforting structure. The universe has ethics, there are guardians, humanity is being guided, outcomes matter, and those who align with the right path will be supported. But the same structure can be used to manipulate. A narrative that claims cosmic authority can justify almost anything: isolation from family, distrust of medicine or institutions, financial exploitation by gurus, and the creation of in-group status systems where belief is a badge of superiority. It is not necessary to accuse every storyteller of bad intent to acknowledge the risk. Systems that make belief a moral requirement tend to police doubt. Systems that frame critics as agents tend to collapse into paranoia. A healthy investigation of Blue Avian lore must keep that sociological reality in view. Another reason the Blue Avians gained traction is that they are visually distinctive. Many alien archetypes blur together: Greys, reptilians, Nordics. A tall blue bird-like being stands out. It has mythic resonance and a built-in symbolic language. Birds as messengers, blue as calm, sky transcendence. In storytelling terms, it's an efficient design. It signals higher rather than predatory. It suggests guidance rather than invasion. The aesthetic itself does moral work before the script even starts. Then there is the internet factor. Online communities do not merely share narratives, they refine them. A claim is made, then interpreted, then remixed into summaries, podcasts, reaction videos, and graphic art. Over time, the story becomes smoother and more coherent than the original testimony. Contradictions are edited out, terms become standardized, an origin story forms, and what began as one person's account becomes a collective myth with multiple confirmations that ultimately trace back to the same source material. This is how modern legends solidify, not through proof, but through cultural compression. To locate the Blue Avians within that process, the key is to treat the narrative as a system. A set of recurring claims that serve certain psychological and community functions. In the next part, we will lay out the major agenda claims associated with the Blue Avians: non-interference, quarantine, ascension, and warnings about manipulation, and then examine the mysteries and contradictions that follow from those claims. If they are guardians, what exactly are they guarding? If they avoid interference, why contact individuals at all? If evidence is withheld to protect free will, why deliver messages designed to change human choices? The answers given by Blue Avian lore are often elegant. Whether they are true is another matter, but the structure of the answers reveals exactly what this myth is built to do. The agenda, guardians, quarantine, and the war over attention. The word agenda implies strategy, intention, and a goal. In Blue Avian narratives, the agenda is rarely described in material terms: resources, territory, technology transfer. Instead, the agenda is framed as spiritual governance. The beings are said to care about human consciousness the way a conservationist cares about an ecosystem. Earth, in these stories, is a protected zone, a place where development must occur without overt domination from outside forces. This is often described as a quarantine, a containment, or a non-interference policy. Humanity must choose its path. The beings may observe, advise, and occasionally intervene at the edges, but they will not openly rule. At first, this seems paradoxical. If the Blue Avians avoid interference, why reveal themselves at all, even privately? The lore typically resolves this by claiming that limited contact preserves free will. It is the difference between a whisper and a broadcast. A whisper can be accepted or rejected. A broadcast changes the environment so drastically that choice becomes coerced by inevitability. This is one of the central philosophical devices of the narrative. It turns the absence of public proof into proof of ethical restraint. It also turns skepticism into a moral issue. If you demand evidence, you are asking for a kind of coercion the beings refuse to provide. Within this framework, the Blue Avians are usually placed in opposition to other non-human forces. The most common antagonist categories include deceptive entities that feed on fear, factions that manipulate elites, and groups that want humans locked into technological dependence. The details vary wildly, but the structure remains stable. Blue Avians represent alignment, calm, and higher ethics. Other factions represent manipulation, extraction, and control. This structure matters because it makes the story emotionally legible. It gives audiences a moral map in a topic otherwise saturated with ambiguity. One of the most repeated claims is that a conflict exists, not necessarily a kinetic war, but a war over attention and belief. In this view, human consciousness is the resource. Fear is not merely an emotion, it is fuel. Media hysteria, political polarization, and cultural panic are not just social problems. They are mechanisms through which darker forces harvest energy or maintain control. The Blue Avians, then, do not fight with weapons. They fight by encouraging a change in the human interior, reduce fear, increase empathy, resist manipulation, and refuse the invitation to hatred. This agenda is appealing because it offers empowerment without violence. It says the battle can be won privately, by individual choice. It says you do not need access to classified documents to participate. You need self-control. It transforms a cosmic drama into a daily practice. What you pay attention to, what you believe, how you react. In the context of modern life, where many people feel powerless, this is not a small comfort. It suggests that the most consequential arena is accessible to everyone. But this is where the narrative becomes complicated. A story that frames emotional regulation as cosmic warfare can become psychologically intense. If fear is fuel for predatory entities, then anxiety becomes not just a personal struggle, but a moral vulnerability. If negative emotion is feeding something, then grief can become shame. Communities built around such beliefs can slide into a kind of spiritual perfectionism, the demand to stay positive, the suspicion that depression signals corruption, the fear that anger opens doors to influence. In the worst cases, it becomes a system where ordinary human pain is treated as evidence of spiritual failure. Blue Avian stories also frequently include warnings about technology, not technology in general. Often the warning is narrower: the misuse of technology to dominate consciousness, surveil populations, and separate humans from natural intuition. In some versions, advanced civilizations are said to have collapsed because they pursued material intelligence without spiritual maturity. Humanity is described as approaching a threshold where its tools outpace its ethics. The Blue Avians, as guardians, want humans to survive this threshold. There is a reason this theme resonates now. Modern societies are saturated with algorithmic persuasion, data harvesting, and an attention economy that monetizes outrage. Even without invoking extraterrestrials, many people feel that technology shapes their emotions more than they shape their own lives. Blue Avian lore translates that diffuse discomfort into a coherent story. There are forces, human and non-human, that benefit from confusion, addiction, and division. The remedy is to reclaim attention. In narrative terms, the Blue Avians become the voice that articulates a very contemporary anxiety in cosmic language. The quarantine concept also connects to another common theme: timeline management. Some accounts suggest that humanity is not merely progressing linearly, but moving through branching futures, some catastrophic, some transformative. The Blue Avians, in this interpretation, are not prophets who dictate a future, but custodians who try to keep certain options alive. Their interventions are said to be minimal but targeted, nudges toward outcomes where humanity retains sovereignty rather than becoming a managed species. Again, this is not something we can verify as fact, but as a story structure, it performs a specific function. It makes the future feel meaningful. It implies that the present is decisive. It turns daily ethical choices into levers that shift civilization. Then there are the mysteries that attach to the Blue Avian agenda, questions that repeatedly reappear because the narrative invites them. Why blue? Why avian at all? Are they biological beings, interdimensional entities, or symbolic projections? Are they a single race or a category label placed on multiple phenomena? Why do accounts often emphasize calmness, nonviolence, and moral instruction rather than concrete guidance? If they are so advanced, why communicate in a way that generates confusion and factionalism? And if they value free will, why position themselves as moral authorities? The lore answers these questions in ways that reveal its core priorities. Blue, in many retellings, is associated with tranquility and higher communication, less about biology, more about resonance. Avian, similarly, is often framed as a form that symbolizes their function as messengers or guardians. In some versions, their form is not fixed. It is chosen to be interpretable to humans. In others, the form is literal but ancient. In others, it is perceived rather than physical, a translation of presence into imagery the human mind can hold. Each answer shifts the story further away from physical evidence and deeper into the realm of interpretation, which makes the narrative more flexible and harder to falsify. This is the heart of the Blue Avian phenomenon. It exists at the edge where belief can thrive without proof. It provides a moral cosmology in which the universe is populated not just by beings, but by intentions. It tells audiences that they are not merely spectators to a secret history, They are participants in a quiet war over attention, ethics, and the shape of the future. The modern source: how the Blue Avians become a named faction. The Blue Avians did not enter popular culture the way a new animal species enters a biology textbook. They entered the way a modern legend enters an online world, through a small number of central storytellers, a flood of secondary commentary, and an ecosystem that rewards coherence over verification. In this ecosystem, a claim does not need to be proven to become real inside a community. It needs to be repeated by the right voices, absorbed into existing myth structures, and defended against skepticism long enough to stabilize into shared language. Once that happens, the narrative gains a kind of social gravity. People speak about it as if it has always been there. In the modern UFO sphere, named factions are the building blocks of mythology. Greys, Nordics, reptilians. These categories function less like zoological classifications and more like character types. Each comes with implied motives and ethical polarity. The Blue Avians, when they become a named faction, are assigned a role with remarkable efficiency: benevolent guardians, spiritually advanced, aligned with non-interference, opposed to manipulation. This role does not arise randomly. It emerges because the wider UFO culture was already structured to receive it. By the time Blue Avians appear as a distinct label, many communities are primed for a higher faction, whose purpose is to rescue the narrative from despair. To see this clearly, you have to understand the problem many UFO subcultures face. If you commit to the idea that governments hide contact, that abductions occur, that elites may be compromised, and that humanity is being manipulated, you end up in a psychological trap. The universe becomes hostile, and the human future feels captured. A myth system that remains purely predatory collapses into paranoia. It either burns out its believers or radicalizes them. The ecosystem needs a stabilizing force, a cosmic counterweight. The Blue Avians, in modern retellings, often serve exactly that function, proof that not all non-human forces are exploitative, and that there is a moral architecture beyond human politics. The next question is how this faction becomes anchored to a source. In many contemporary cases, the process begins with a single, prominent insider narrative. Someone claiming to have been involved in secret programs, exposed to hidden realities, and then redirected by non-human forces toward disclosure. This is a specific genre. It is not simply testimony, it is a hero's journey built for the digital era. The narrator starts as an ordinary person, is pulled into extraordinary operations, witnesses morally compromising activity, encounters non-human intelligences, then returns to tell the public, often framed as a reluctant messenger who would prefer anonymity but feels ethically compelled to speak. This structure is persuasive because it resembles familiar moral storytelling. It suggests sacrifice, risk, and sincerity. It also establishes an asymmetry of knowledge. The storyteller knows what you cannot know, and any gap in evidence becomes part of the narrative logic. Classified material cannot be shown, names cannot be revealed, details must be withheld for safety. In a vacuum, these limitations would weaken credibility. In a myth ecosystem, they can strengthen it because they function as dramatic constraints. The story becomes dangerous, which makes it feel important. Once a central storyteller introduces Blue Avians in this context, the label spreads through a predictable set of channels. First come interviews and long-form podcasts, where narrative time allows for immersion. Then come summary videos, where key claims are compressed into clean bullet points. Then come graphic depictions, where the beings acquire a consistent look, even if original descriptions varied. Then come secondary confirmations, people who claim to have seen the same beings in dreams, meditation, or their own contact experiences. At this stage, the narrative can detach from the source. It becomes free-floating. People encounter the Blue Avians not through the original testimony, but through community consensus. This is an important moment because it creates the illusion of multiple independent witnesses. In reality, many confirmations may be downstream of the same initial narrative. Someone hears the story, internalizes the imagery, then later experiences a dream or meditation vision that matches what they already know. They interpret this as validation, and the community treats it as corroboration. This is not necessarily dishonest, it is how human cognition works. Suggestive imagery, especially when emotionally charged, can influence dream content and altered states. In environments where people are actively seeking contact, expectation becomes a powerful generator of experience. The Blue Avians also benefit from what can be called the moral premium. In contested paranormal spaces, benevolent claims are often easier to sell than technical claims because they feel meaningful. A detailed engineering description of a craft invites scrutiny. A message about compassion invites agreement. If an entity tells you to be less fearful and more ethical, it is difficult to argue against the instruction without sounding cynical. This gives the story a kind of rhetorical shield. Even if the being's existence is unproven, the advice seems harmless and therefore credible. The moral content becomes an argument for the reality of the messenger. Why would a liar tell people to be kinder? But moral messaging also creates incentives for narrative escalation. Once the community accepts Blue Avians as benevolent, storytellers can intensify the cosmic drama without losing trust. They can add antagonists, manipulators, harvesters, deceptive factions, and position the Blue Avians as the stabilizing authority. This moves the story from contact to cosmic politics. It also creates a hierarchy of insiders. The people who receive messages from Blue Avians are elevated. If the beings are guardians, then those contacted by them are implicitly important. This is where myth systems can become socially dangerous, because spiritual contact becomes a status resource. In many communities, the Blue Avian narrative is woven into a broader disclosure arc. Disclosure is imagined not as a sudden release of information, but as a managed process staged over years, with the public gradually acclimated to the reality of non-human presence. The Blue Avians in this frame may be described as influencing the pacing, preventing catastrophic revelation while allowing enough leaks to awaken the population. This provides a built-in explanation for why the story remains in the twilight zone, neither fully public nor fully hidden. The ambiguity is reframed as evidence of a controlled transition. This is also where the spheres motif becomes significant in some retellings. The idea that large, mysterious spheres or constructs exist in orbit or near Earth functions as a mythic anchor. It gives the story a physical placeholder, something grand and unseen that justifies the scale of the claims. People do not need to see the spheres to believe in them. The very invisibility becomes part of the mystique. The spheres act like the invisible castle in folklore. They make the hidden world feel structurally real. Even without evidence, the image organizes the imagination. Now consider how the narrative handles disagreement. In a typical evidence-based domain, disagreement is resolved by data. In this domain, disagreement is resolved by allegiance. If you question the story, you may be told you are not ready, not open, or influenced by negative forces. This is not unique to Blue Avian lore. It is common in closed belief systems. But it appears here with a particular twist. Skepticism becomes spiritually framed. The story teaches that deception exists and that fear is a weapon. Therefore, critics can be interpreted as agents of deception, and doubt can be interpreted as fear. The belief system absorbs criticism as proof of its own warnings. This creates a powerful psychological loop. If you believe the Blue Avians are benevolent guardians opposed to manipulative forces, you may start scanning your environment for manipulation. You may interpret mainstream dismissal as confirmation that powerful interests want the truth suppressed. You may interpret emotional discomfort as evidence that the message is high vibration and therefore challenging. The narrative becomes self-reinforcing, and once it becomes self-reinforcing, it can survive even if the original storyteller is discredited, because the community's identity is no longer attached to a person, it is attached to the worldview. Still, the modern origin question matters because it tells us how the story gained its initial traction. In many cases, the rise of a named faction correlates with the rise of a media personality who functions as a narrative hub. The hub does three things. First, it introduces a distinctive image, Blue Avians, into a crowded taxonomy. Second, it provides a moral frame that makes the image attractive. Third, it links the image to a larger plotline, secret programs, cosmic councils, human awakening, so the audience receives not just a creature, but a universe. Once that happens, secondary content creators amplify the story by connecting dots. They link Blue Avians to ancient bird deities, to religious angels, to mythic guardians. They interpret modern events through the lens of the narrative. They build timelines. They produce charts. The aesthetic of research, diagrams, lists, maps, creates the feeling of structure. Structure creates legitimacy. Legitimacy invites more belief, and belief invites more content. The story becomes an economy. This is where incentives become impossible to ignore. A narrative that generates attention can generate money, status, and community power. That does not automatically mean it is false, but it does mean that truth and popularity become entangled. In this environment, a storyteller may feel pressure to deliver new revelations to maintain engagement. Audiences can become conditioned to escalation. The message must expand, the stakes must rise, the cosmic timeline must tighten. A stable, modest claim is not rewarded. The internet rewards novelty. In the worst cases, the myth becomes a treadmill where the next update must be bigger than the last. So how do we evaluate the Blue Avians as a named faction without falling into either blind belief or reflexive dismissal? We separate two categories: narrative claims and evidence claims. Narrative claims explain meaning, morality, and intention. Evidence claims assert observable facts, physical beings, objects, locations, and events that should leave traces. Blue Avian lore is often strong on narrative and weak on evidence. That does not make it useless. It means it should be approached with the same caution we would apply to any system that offers cosmic meaning without public verification. Evidence: what people point to, what it actually is. When people argue about the Blue Avians, they rarely argue about the same thing. One person is arguing about a personal experience they consider undeniable. Another is arguing about the absence of public, testable data. Both can speak confidently while talking past each other. The reason is that evidence means something different inside belief communities than it means in a forensic or scientific context. In Blue Avian circles, evidence is often experiential, internal impressions, perceived synchronicities, meditative visions, dreams, or a feeling of recognition when hearing the story. In an evidence-based framework, those experiences are real as experiences, but they do not automatically establish an external cause. The difference between those two statements is where the entire controversy lives. The first category people point to is visual material: drawings, paintings, digital art, and the occasional photograph or still frame circulated as proof. The problem with this category is not that images are meaningless. The problem is that images are easy to produce, easy to mislabel, and easy to strip from context. In an online ecosystem, an image can move faster than the story of where it came from. It can be reposted with new captions, new dates, and new claimed origins. Over time, the image becomes detached from provenance. At that point, it functions more like an icon than a document. Icons can be powerful. They are not, by themselves, verification. Many Blue Avian images look consistent because communities reward consistency. Once a popular depiction emerges, tall, blue-feathered, calm expression, avian facial structure, later depictions follow it. This is not evidence of convergence on truth. It is evidence of mimetic stabilization. The same process occurs with folklore creatures and urban legends. The more a community circulates a standard look, the more future experiences and artistic outputs will match it. A witness describing a blue bird-like being in an altered state may be describing perception filtered through an available cultural template, even if they believe they are reporting a raw encounter. The second category is testimony. First-hand accounts from individuals who claim direct contact. Testimony is not worthless. It is a form of data about human experience. But testimony has known weaknesses when the claim is extraordinary and the context is private. The more private the encounter, the more difficult it is to cross-check. Blue Avian encounters are typically described as telepathic, dreamlike, or occurring in meditation, which means they produce minimal external trace. The encounter cannot be independently witnessed, measured, or recorded. The story becomes the only artifact. At that point, credibility rests on narrative coherence and perceived sincerity, tools that are useful in courtroom contexts, but fragile in high-ambiguity paranormal contexts where misinterpretation is common and deception is possible. The third category is hypnotic regression, sometimes used to recover hidden contact memories. Regression occupies a controversial position because it feels like forensic retrieval, but often behaves like story generation. Research and clinical experience have long established that hypnosis can increase confidence without increasing accuracy. It can produce vivid memories that feel true while being partly constructed from suggestion, expectation, and the brain's desire for narrative closure. Even when a practitioner is careful, the very premise, "there is a hidden memory here," can guide the mind toward producing content consistent with the client's belief environment. In communities where Blue Avians are already present as an archetype, regression sessions can become less like excavation and more like collaborative myth-making. The fourth category is channeling transcripts and downloads, messages received in trance, meditation, automatic writing, or intuitive states. For believers, this is often the core evidence. They point to consistency of message across different channelers, themes of compassion, free will, warnings about fear manipulation, and encouragement to disengage from panic cycles. For skeptics, consistency is exactly what you would expect from shared culture. People read similar material, share similar values, and inhabit the same interpretive universe, so their messages converge. The key issue is that channeling is not designed to produce falsifiable claims. It produces moral and metaphysical assertions that cannot be tested in the ordinary way. This makes it resilient. It also makes it impossible to use as public proof. Channeling material often includes details that sound technical: densities, counsels, cosmic laws, vibrational thresholds. The vocabulary mimics systematization. It creates the feeling of a structured cosmology, which can be deeply persuasive. But structure is not the same as verification. A coherent system can be fictional. A messy system can be real. In evidence terms, coherence is a weak signal because the human mind is skilled at building coherence from ambiguity. This is why people can have intense, life-altering spiritual experiences that are internally consistent and still not settle questions about external entities. The fifth category is synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences interpreted as confirmation. Someone hears about Blue Avians and then sees repeated bird imagery, blue feathers, unusual dreams, or symbols that feel too precise to be random. The subjective force of synchronicity can be overwhelming. It can feel like the world is speaking back. The evidentiary problem is that humans are pattern detectors operating in a sea of stimuli. Once a concept becomes salient, your brain starts tagging relevant inputs. This is not proof of deception or delusion. It is normal cognition. But it means synchronicity is unreliable as an external indicator. It can confirm that a narrative has captured attention. It cannot confirm that the narrative's entities exist independently. The sixth category is secondary corroboration, where someone claims a military source, an intelligence contact, or an anonymous insider has confirmed the Blue Avians. This category is especially influential because it borrows credibility from institutions people associate with secrets. The problem is that anonymous sourcing cannot be audited by the public. It may be true, it may be a misunderstanding, it may be an intentional hoax, it may be rumor moving through a closed network until it returns as confirmed. In high-secrecy domains, rumor ecology becomes its own ecosystem. People repeat what they heard from someone who heard it from someone else, and the repetition itself becomes evidence. This is how intelligence myths spread even within professional circles. The aura of secrecy protects the claim from normal friction. Then there are evidence-adjacent claims, references to unusual aerial phenomena, unexplained military encounters, or declassified footage. These are sometimes used as a general foundation, proof that something non-human is present, and then the Blue Avians are positioned as one identity within that broader reality. This is a common rhetorical move. Start with a widely discussed ambiguity, then attach a specific mythology to it. The ambiguity gives the mythology borrowed legitimacy. But even if unexplained phenomena exist, it does not follow that a specific race described in spiritual contact narratives is responsible. The gap between something unknown and Blue Avians is enormous, and it is usually crossed by story rather than data. A serious evaluation requires asking what kind of evidence would actually move the claim into a verifiable domain. It would require independent witnesses observing the same entity under conditions that reduce suggestion. It would require consistent, precise predictions that can be checked. Dates, locations, measurable events. It would require physical artifacts with chain of custody, materials, biological samples, or instruments registering anomalies in a way that can be replicated. It would require documentation not easily produced by a single person, multi-source records, contemporaneous logs, third-party verification. The Blue Avian narrative, as it usually appears, does not deliver this. Instead, it delivers what might be called intimacy evidence, evidence designed to persuade the individual, not the public. This is the distinction that matters most. Private certainty and public proof are different categories. A person can be fully sincere and deeply transformed by an experience they interpret as contact. That sincerity can be real. The transformation can be real. But if the evidence remains private, the claim cannot be treated as a public fact without lowering standards in a way that makes the entire category of truth unstable. Once any vivid internal experience becomes a public claim about external reality, there is no principled stopping point. The same standards that validate Blue Avians would validate contradictory entities and incompatible cosmologies all at once. This is why Blue Avian communities often shift the goalposts. When asked for public evidence, they may argue that public evidence is not permitted by cosmic rules, or that proof would violate free will, or that the beings avoid exposure. These arguments can be internally coherent within the worldview. They are also convenient shields against falsification. If a claim explains in advance why it cannot be tested, it becomes immune to testing. That immunity is not necessarily dishonest, but it changes what the claim is. It turns the claim from a factual assertion into a belief system. And yet, there is a reason these narratives persist. They often speak to genuine psychological and social realities. Fear manipulation, institutional distrust, the feeling that modern life is spiritually thin, the hunger for moral orientation. The Blue Avians become a vessel for those realities. Whether or not the beings exist externally, the myth organizes meaning. It provides a storyline that makes suffering and confusion feel navigable. This is precisely why a purely debunking approach often fails. People are not only defending a claim, they are defending a structure that supports them. The correct next step is not to declare victory for belief or skepticism. The correct next step is to examine the architecture of the larger myth system that Blue Avians sit within. Councils, laws of non-interference, cosmic enforcement, factions with competing agendas. If the Blue Avians are guardians within a governed cosmos, then the story implies a mechanism of governance. Who sets the rules? Who enforces them? How is non-interference maintained across rival factions? What is the jurisdiction? These questions push the narrative away from personal experience and toward internal consistency at the system level. In the next part, we will analyze the alliance model, the councils, spheres, and cosmic bureaucracy that Blue Avian lore often relies on, and we will test what that model explains, what it avoids, and where it breaks under its own weight. The alliance model, councils, spheres, and cosmic bureaucracy. Once the Blue Avians become more than a single encounter story, once they become a faction with a role, the narrative almost always expands into governance. It introduces councils, alliances, federations, and laws. This is not an accidental embellishment. It is a structural requirement. If multiple non-human groups exist and have interacted with Earth for a long time, then either the situation is chaotic, open predation, constant intrusion, or it is regulated. Blue Avian lore usually chooses regulation because regulation explains why the world is not already transformed beyond recognition. It explains why contact is inconsistent. It explains why disclosure feels stalled. And it explains why benevolent beings can exist without simply solving everything. This governance layer is often described in managerial terms: rules of engagement, non-interference principles, jurisdiction boundaries, oversight bodies, and enforcement mechanisms. The language resembles a cosmic version of international law. Earth is portrayed as a protected zone, sometimes compared to a nature preserve, sometimes described as a quarantined planet where developing civilizations must evolve without overt domination. The Blue Avians, in many retellings, are positioned as aligned with enforcement of these rules, not always as the top authority, but as part of the oversight network, sometimes acting as auditors or guardians. The first function of the alliance model is to convert mystery into administration. If you see unexplained phenomena but no public landing, the model says that is the point. Open contact is prohibited. If you hear rumors of secret deals, the model says those are loopholes or violations, illicit agreements made by human elites. If you see conflicting behaviors, some encounters benevolent, some frightening, the model says different factions with different permissions. The model absorbs contradictions by distributing them across actors and rules. This is why councils appear so frequently. In narrative systems, councils provide legitimacy without requiring evidence. A council implies order. It implies deliberation. It implies that the universe has a moral and procedural architecture. The exact names vary: federations, confederations, guardians, alliances, councils of elders, but the role is consistent. They provide the story with a spine. Without them, the myth collapses into a set of disconnected encounters. With them, encounters become policy outcomes. A second function of the alliance model is to solve the benevolence problem. If benevolent beings exist and are powerful, why is Earth still full of suffering? Governance is the answer. Benevolence is constrained by law. The guardians cannot simply intervene because intervention would violate a developmental process. They can nudge, advise, and prevent extreme violations, but they cannot override human choice. This makes suffering compatible with oversight. It also gives the Blue Avian agenda a plausible limitation. They want to help, but they refuse to coerce. But this creates the first major tension. Rules are only meaningful if they are enforced. If rival factions exist, some manipulative, some predatory, what stops them from ignoring the rules? The alliance model typically answers in one of two ways. The first is deterrence. Enforcement entities possess power that makes violations costly. The second is jurisdiction. Earth is surrounded by a containment structure that restricts access, so intrusions require special conditions. This is where the spheres motif often enters. In some versions of the lore, large spheres or constructs, sometimes described as in orbit near the moon or stationed in a way that is not publicly visible, act as monitoring or stabilizing mechanisms. They are presented as a kind of infrastructure: surveillance, frequency modulation, timeline stabilization, or quarantine enforcement. The spheres function as narrative technology. They make the governance claims feel physically grounded without requiring a public artifact you can point to. The spheres are not merely objects. They are the story's answer to how. If you map this structure carefully, you can see why it is so attractive. The alliance model turns the entire UFO problem into an administrative dilemma. Why don't we have full disclosure? Because disclosure must be managed. Why don't the good beings fix everything? Because they are bound by higher law. Why do bad things still happen? Because humans retain agency, and some factions exploit loopholes. The universe becomes a legal ecosystem. For audiences frustrated by randomness, this is satisfying. It says chaos is not ultimate. It is contained inside a larger order. However, the moment you accept the alliance model, you inherit a set of internal questions that the narrative must answer to remain coherent. The first question is legitimacy. Who wrote the laws? A council implies authority, but authority implies origin. Did the laws emerge from consensus among advanced civilizations? Were they imposed by a higher intelligence? Are they moral principles built into reality itself? Different versions of the lore offer different answers, and those answers matter because they determine whether the system is ethical or merely powerful. A council that enforces rules because it is morally superior is different from a council that enforces rules because it won a war. The second question is enforcement consistency. If Earth is protected, why do accounts include abductions, intimidation, and manipulation? The alliance model typically responds by categorizing such events as unauthorized, historical, or misinterpreted. But the more exceptions you add, the more the rule becomes decorative. A quarantine that still permits large-scale violation begins to resemble a story device rather than a functional policy. To preserve coherence, the narrative must claim either that violations are rare and constrained, or that they are allowed under narrow conditions that still preserve the spirit of non-interference. This leads to the third question: loopholes. Blue Avian lore often treats consent as a key mechanism. If humans invite influence through fear, agreements, or spiritual vulnerability, then interference is reframed as permitted. This is one reason the narrative emphasizes personal sovereignty and awareness. The implication is that governance operates partly through metaphysical law. Beings cannot override your will unless you surrender it. In the story, this turns ethics into protection. But it also creates a dangerous ambiguity because it can shift blame onto victims. If someone is harmed, the harm can be framed as the result of their spiritual weakness or unconscious consent. The fourth question is scale. If councils exist and operate across civilizations, the system must manage vast diversity of motives, biology, and culture. How does a universal law apply to radically different forms of intelligence? How does it handle non-human psychology? A cosmic bureaucracy sophisticated enough to regulate interstellar actors implies extraordinary administrative capacity. That capacity, if real, would likely produce observable stability, consistent patterns, clear boundaries, and predictable outcomes. Yet the data we have, ambiguous sightings, contradictory testimonies, cultural variation, looks messy. The alliance model resolves this by placing most activity beyond public perception, but the more activity is hidden, the less the model can be distinguished from pure narrative. The fifth question is communication. If the alliance model is real, why communicate through scattered private channels instead of coherent public policy? The standard answer is again free will. The system avoids open contact to prevent coercion, but this raises a paradox. Private messages delivered to selected individuals can be more coercive than public information because they create authority hierarchies. A person claiming direct contact can demand trust without accountability. In a public disclosure scenario, everyone receives the same information and can debate it. In a private revelation scenario, the community is asked to trust the messenger. The alliance model often warns about deception, yet its communication structure creates the perfect conditions for deception to flourish. This is where the Blue Avians are positioned as a corrective. They are often described as warning against false authorities, encouraging humility, discouraging hero worship, and emphasizing inner discernment. That message is logically necessary because without it, the myth collapses into cult dynamics. But the message is also difficult to apply in practice. A community that believes in Blue Avians because a charismatic figure says so is already participating in the authority structure the message warns against. The story attempts to solve this by insisting that the beings teach personal sovereignty. In reality, communities still cluster around interpreters. Another component of the alliance model is timeline governance. In some versions, councils are not only preventing overt invasion, they are managing probabilities, keeping certain futures available. This is used to explain why prophecies shift, why predicted events fail, and why the message evolves. If a predicted catastrophe does not occur, the narrative can claim that interventions succeeded or timelines diverged. This mechanism makes the story extremely resilient. It transforms failed predictions into evidence that the system is working, but it also makes the story unfalsifiable. A claim that always absorbs outcomes cannot be tested. At this stage, a disciplined approach is to separate what the alliance model explains from what it protects. It explains why evidence is scarce. It explains why the world is not radically altered. It explains contradictory encounters. But it also protects the narrative from verification by placing the decisive mechanisms outside public reach. Councils beyond observation, rules beyond measurement, enforcement beyond auditing, and timeline shifts that redefine prediction. This does not automatically render the model false. It does, however, define the cost of accepting it. The cost is that the model cannot be proven in ordinary ways, and therefore must be treated as a metaphysical framework rather than a factual report, unless it produces specific, checkable outputs. In Blue Avian lore, those outputs are usually ethical and psychological: reduce fear, resist manipulation, cultivate compassion, reclaim attention. These are valuable practices regardless of cosmic bureaucracy, but they do not establish the bureaucracy as real. Now, the story's internal stakes depend on a final question: if governance exists, who enforces it when it truly matters? In the alliance model, enforcement is often implied rather than described. We hear about restrictions, but rarely about transparent consequences. We hear about councils, but rarely about public adjudication. This is where the narrative tends to introduce antagonists as persistent but contained, active enough to create drama, limited enough to preserve order. The result is a carefully balanced cosmology. Danger exists, but it is not ultimate. Humanity is threatened, but not doomed. Intervention is possible, but not guaranteed. The opponents: reptilians, manipulators, and fear economies. A myth system that includes guardians almost always includes predators. The Blue Avians, in their modern role, are rarely introduced alone. They arrive in a landscape already populated by antagonists, manipulative factions, parasitic entities, deceptive false light forces, and the now familiar archetypes of the UFO taxonomy: reptilians, coercive greys, shadowy councils, elite collaborations. The details vary depending on the community, but the function is consistent. The antagonist is the engine that turns a spiritual message into an urgent drama. This is not just storytelling, it is social physics. A community bonds faster around a threat than around an abstraction. Be compassionate is a principle. We are being manipulated is a rallying cry. Once you introduce an enemy, you generate cohesion, vigilance, and identity. You also generate a mechanism for handling discomfort. Doubt becomes infiltration. Criticism becomes sabotage. Internal conflict becomes the work of an external force. The narrative becomes self-protecting. Within Blue Avian lore, the most common opponent claim is not invasion, it is manipulation. The opponents are said to operate through influence rather than open war, because open war would violate non-interference rules or trigger enforcement. Instead, they farm fear, feed on emotional output, corrupt institutions, or steer human development toward technological dependence and moral fragmentation. This framing accomplishes two things simultaneously. It explains why the world is chaotic without requiring visible alien armies, and it makes ordinary human problems feel cosmically significant. Addiction, polarization, propaganda, these are no longer merely social failures. They are vectors in a non-human strategy. The term fear economy is useful here because it describes how the story functions even if the cosmology is not literally true. In modern life, fear is monetized. Outrage produces clicks. Anxiety produces consumption. Conflict produces loyalty. Political actors and media systems are structurally rewarded for keeping populations aroused and divided. You do not need extraterrestrials to explain this, but Blue Avian narratives often place this observable phenomenon inside a larger metaphysical frame. Fear is not only profitable, it is nutritive to predatory intelligences. The visible economy becomes a shadow of an invisible one. This is one reason the antagonist claim spreads so well. It merges a real verifiable pattern, fear as a driver of social systems, with an unverified extension, fear as energy harvested by non-human entities. The extension is impossible to prove in public terms, but it is psychologically compelling because it offers a single explanation for many frustrations. If you feel constantly pressured, distracted, and polarized, the story says that is not an accident, it is a strategy. And the antidote is not only political reform, it is inner sovereignty. However, once you build a worldview around manipulation by hidden forces, you face a critical risk. The worldview can become indistinguishable from paranoia. Paranoia is not defined by the presence of threats. Threats exist in reality. Paranoia is defined by the collapse of proportion and the inability to falsify the belief. If every contradiction proves the theory, if every critic is an agent, if every emotional low is an attack, then the belief becomes a closed loop. Many Blue Avian communities attempt to prevent this by emphasizing calmness and compassion, but the antagonist structure constantly reintroduces suspicion through the back door. The villain archetypes in this space serve specific psychological roles. Reptilian narratives, for example, often function as a personification of cold predation, intelligence without empathy, dominance without conscience. Whether or not such beings exist, the archetype maps neatly onto human experiences of exploitation and betrayal. The gray archetype often maps onto clinical intrusion, experimentation, detachment, the feeling of being used. The elite collaborator archetype maps onto institutional distrust, the idea that those in power are compromised and trade the public's welfare for their own advantage. Each villain is a symbolic container for anxieties people already carry. Because these villains are symbolic containers, the story can scale infinitely. Any social event can be interpreted as manipulation. Any new technology can be framed as a control grid. Any institutional failure can be recast as intentional. The narrative becomes a universal solvent. It dissolves complexity into a single moral geometry: predators versus guardians, control versus awakening. This simplification can feel clarifying, especially in a world that is genuinely complex. But simplification comes at a cost. It can flatten nuance, encourage scapegoating, and make ordinary disagreement feel like warfare. This is where the Blue Avians are typically positioned as an ethical boundary. The good faction warns that the opponents win by provoking fear and hatred, and therefore the correct response is not rage, but refusal. Refuse panic, refuse dehumanization, refuse obsessive attention. In principle, this is a stabilizing instruction. In practice, it can create a contradiction. A community that spends large amounts of time cataloging enemies, decoding manipulation, and sharing alarming content is feeding attention into the very fear economy it claims to resist. The myth says, do not feed the predators. The community behavior can become, constantly describe the predators so everyone stays vigilant. Vigilance can quietly become fixation. The fixation has predictable social effects. It produces status hierarchies based on who is most awake. It encourages purity tests. If you question the enemy narrative, you might be accused of being compromised. It rewards people who deliver dramatic warnings. It punishes those who advocate ordinary skepticism. And it can fracture into factional conflict because different subgroups disagree about which enemies are real, which are false light, and which sources are infiltrated. A myth system that begins as a call to compassion can evolve into a labyrinth of suspicion. There is also a moral hazard in the way enemy narratives handle suffering. If harm is always interpreted as manipulation by non-human forces, human responsibility can be diluted. Bad actors can become controlled rather than accountable. Systems can become rigged by aliens rather than reformable by human effort. The narrative can drift into fatalism. If everything is controlled, nothing matters. To prevent that drift, Blue Avian lore usually insists on personal agency. But the more powerful the enemy is portrayed, the harder it is to maintain believable agency. This is a balancing act the myth must constantly manage. The enemy must be strong enough to explain chaos, but not so strong that hope collapses. A second hazard is emotional management. If fear is framed as food for predators, then ordinary human fear becomes morally charged. People can start policing their own emotions with anxiety. If I feel afraid, am I feeding something? This can create a cycle where fear about fear becomes the main psychological burden. Some individuals respond by suppressing negative emotion and forcing positivity, which can fragment their inner life. Others respond by doubling down on vigilance, which amplifies anxiety. The narrative promises liberation from fear, but its enemy architecture can trap people in fear with a spiritual label attached. There is a third hazard that is more concrete: exploitation. Any system that claims hidden enemies and hidden guardians creates demand for interpreters, people who can tell you what is real, what is dangerous, what is aligned, what is a trap. Interpreters can become authorities. Authorities can become gatekeepers. Gatekeepers can monetize access, whether through paid readings, courses, private communities, or exclusive updates. The presence of enemies makes the audience feel vulnerable. Vulnerability increases dependence on the interpreter. This is how a fear economy can form inside a belief ecosystem, even when the stated message is peace. To evaluate the opponents in Blue Avian lore responsibly, it helps to apply a simple test. Does the storyline increase your capacity to act wisely in the real world, or does it reduce you to obsession and suspicion? A belief that encourages discernment, compassion, and grounded action can be psychologically beneficial regardless of metaphysical truth. A belief that encourages isolation, constant dread, and hostility toward outsiders is corrosive even if it contains fragments of truth. The Blue Avian message, as typically presented, claims to be the first kind. The enemy architecture often pulls communities toward the second. The deeper reason antagonist narratives spread is that they offer a kind of moral clarity that people crave. Real life is morally mixed. Institutions fail for many reasons: incompetence, incentives, bureaucracy, corruption, complexity. That messiness is unsatisfying. A cosmic enemy story is satisfying because it replaces mess with intent. If something bad happened, someone wanted it to happen. If the world feels manipulated, someone is manipulating it. This restores a sense of logic. It also restores a sense of personal significance. If you can see the manipulation, you are not just a person living through history, you are a participant in a hidden conflict. But moral clarity can turn into moral inflation. Once you label an opponent as metaphysically predatory, any compromise with them becomes impossible, and any nuance becomes suspect. Communities can start treating ordinary political or social disagreement as evidence of infiltration. The myth escalates everyday life into spiritual warfare. That escalation is emotionally addictive. It turns conversation into crusade. It also creates exhaustion because perpetual war, even symbolic war, burns the nervous system. This brings us back to the critical question the narrative itself raises. What does it do to fear? If the Blue Avians are guardians opposing a fear-harvesting economy, the litmus test is whether engagement with the story measurably reduces fear in its audience. Not theoretically, not rhetorically, in practice. Does it make people calmer, kinder, and more capable of living? Or does it keep them cycling through alarming content, scanning for enemies, and feeling perpetually on the edge of attack? Why avian? Why blue? The symbolic anatomy of the myth. If you strip the Blue Avians down to their essentials, what remains is not a biology lesson. What remains is design. A tall, calm, blue bird-like being is an image engineered, intentionally or not, to activate very old human instincts about authority, transcendence, and the boundary between worlds. This is why the Blue Avians stabilize so quickly as a believable presence inside a community. They arrive preloaded with meaning. Start with the avian form. Across cultures and across eras, birds have been used as symbols for what humans cannot do. Leave the ground, cross distances with ease, vanish into the sky, return from unknown places. Birds occupy a domain humans can see but cannot inhabit. They are close enough to observe, distant enough to feel mysterious. That makes them ideal carriers of supernatural messaging. When humans invent intermediaries between Earth and the beyond, birds are an obvious template. They represent access to a higher layer of reality without requiring an entirely alien shape. Bird imagery is also psychologically efficient because it expresses liminality, the state of existing between categories. A bird is not bound to the earth, but it also returns to it. It moves between domains. In mythic thinking, that movement becomes a metaphor for beings who move between worlds, states, or dimensions. This is why avian-human hybrids appear again and again in myth and religious art. They embody contact. They are the literalized idea of a messenger. The Blue Avians inherit this entire symbolic lineage without needing to declare it. Even if someone has never studied comparative mythology, the image still lands. A feathered figure implies a messenger. A bird-like face implies non-human intelligence that is still emotionally legible. The being becomes other without becoming incomprehensible. That balance matters. If you make an entity too strange, it triggers revulsion or dismissal. If you make it too human, it triggers suspicion. Why would aliens look like us? The avian-human blend sits in a psychologically sweet spot, familiar enough to connect with, strange enough to respect. There is another layer. Birds as watchers. Predatory birds, in particular, signal surveillance from above. Even without predation, the idea of an aerial perspective implies oversight. A being shaped like a bird suggests a being that sees the whole landscape. That aligns with the Blue Avian role in modern lore. Guardians, monitors, auditors of Earth's development. The form matches the function. You do not need a technical explanation for how they monitor. The symbolism does the work. Now add the humanoid posture. In most Blue Avian depictions, the beings stand upright, often tall, with calm body language. Upright posture signals agency and deliberation. It signals that the being is not an animal. It is a person-like intelligence with intent. This matters because the message associated with Blue Avians is moral and instructional. A purely animal form would not carry that authority as easily. The humanoid silhouette is the platform upon which moral messaging can stand. If the avian aspect makes the being a messenger, the humanoid aspect makes it a teacher. This is where the modern angel comparison becomes useful, not as a claim that angels and aliens are the same, but as an observation about narrative mechanics. Many angel depictions combine wings, symbolizing access to higher realms, with human faces, symbolizing comprehensibility and moral presence. The Blue Avians reverse the emphasis, less winged human, more bird-faced humanoid. But the function is similar. They are presented as higher, calm, ethically oriented, and reluctant to coerce. This is why Blue Avians are often described as emotionally quiet. In testimony, they rarely rage or threaten. They communicate without spectacle. They feel like administrators of moral law rather than warriors. That demeanor is not a small detail. It is part of the symbol package. A being that is calm implies control. Control implies maturity. Maturity implies authority. Authority makes the message easier to accept. Then there is the color. Blue is not a random choice. In human perception, blue is strongly associated with sky and ocean, two vast domains that dwarf the human body. Blue implies depth, distance, and calm. It is a color that suggests a stable horizon rather than immediate threat. In many modern contexts, blue also implies trust. Institutions use it. Technology brands use it, uniforms use it. The cultural coding is not universal in every detail, but the broad pattern is consistent. Blue feels safe, rational, and expansive. For a myth system trying to introduce a benevolent faction, blue is an efficient visual shorthand. It communicates not hostile before any dialogue occurs. It signals a being aligned with the sky rather than the underground. It suggests elevation, not ambush. In that sense, blue is doing the same work as the being's calm demeanor. It reduces threat perception. But blue also carries a spiritual association in contemporary metaphysical subcultures. Even when people avoid explicit jargon, many audiences have absorbed the idea that blue is linked to communication, truth, and clarity. Whether those associations are objectively grounded is irrelevant to the mimetic function. In an online myth environment, the goal is not scientific accuracy, the goal is resonance. Blue resonates as higher communication. It supports the idea that the beings communicate telepathically and ethically rather than verbally and coercively. Combine these elements and you get a creature design that is unusually sticky in the mind. A good meme, using the term in its original sense, has three properties. It is distinctive, it is easy to describe, and it carries meaning even in compressed form. Tall blue bird people who warn about fear manipulation is instantly recognizable. It can be summarized in a sentence, illustrated in a single image, and debated endlessly without needing technical knowledge. That makes it ideal for internet spread. This is also why Blue Avians tend to be positioned above the usual alien caste. Greys and reptilians, as archetypes, often trigger unease. They are linked to intrusion or dominance. The Blue Avians trigger a different emotional palette: relief, reassurance, moral orientation. If the myth system is full of villains and manipulation, the audience needs an anchor that feels clean. The Blue Avians, by design, are that anchor. However, the very effectiveness of this design creates a risk. The image can become more persuasive than the evidence. People can recognize the being because it matches a deep symbolic template, not because they have encountered an external entity. Recognition in this context is not proof, it is resonance. Resonance can be meaningful, but it is not the same as verification. This distinction matters because symbolic designs can produce what looks like convergence. Multiple people may independently describe similar beings, not because they are witnessing the same external race, but because they are drawing from the same human symbolic library. Birds as messengers, blue as calm authority, humanoids as moral teachers. These are shared cognitive materials. They can generate similar outputs across different minds, especially under similar conditions. Meditation, dreams, altered states, and communities where the image is circulating constantly. The Blue Avians also fit neatly into the broader modern tension between technology and meaning. A purely technological alien, mechanical, clinical, indifferent, does not answer the question many people are actually asking. The question is not, are we alone? It is, does anything care? The Blue Avian design answers that question visually. It looks like a caretaker. It looks like a sentinel. It looks like a being that would speak softly and judge ethically. That aesthetic promise is powerful, especially for audiences exhausted by political chaos and institutional distrust. Now consider how the design interacts with the alliance model from the previous part. A cosmic council needs representatives that feel legitimate. If you populate a council with greys and reptilians, the council feels predatory or morally ambiguous. If you include a serene, blue, messenger-like presence, the council feels balanced. The Blue Avians stabilize the governance myth aesthetically and morally. They make cosmic bureaucracy feel ethical rather than merely powerful. But symbolism alone cannot carry a story forever. Eventually, the audience asks, if these beings are real and active, how do they actually interact with humans? How is contact initiated? Why are messages so private and inconsistent? Why do people receive downloads that cannot be audited? How do we distinguish contact from imagination, intuition, trauma processing, or suggestion? The Blue Avian myth often responds by shifting the mechanism of contact away from physical encounters and toward consciousness-based interaction. That shift is not incidental. It solves a problem. Physical contact produces artifacts and risks exposure. Consciousness contact produces intimacy and avoids verification. It also allows the message to remain moral rather than technical. This is where the next part begins. Contact mechanics, telepathy, downloads, and the problem of private revelation. In most modern Blue Avian accounts, the decisive event is not a landing. It is not a craft on a runway, a body recovered, or a broadcast to the public. The decisive event is internal, a message received without audible sound, an image placed in the mind, a sense of presence accompanied by instruction, a dream that feels more real than waking life, a meditation that turns into a dialogue. This matters because it shifts the entire Blue Avian question from the domain of external observation into the domain of subjective experience. The narrative is not structured like an encounter with an animal. It is structured like an encounter with meaning. The first mechanism described is telepathy. In these stories, telepathy is presented as communication without language, a transfer of concepts rather than sentences. Witnesses often say they did not hear words, but understood intention. This is an important detail because it preemptively resolves inconsistencies. If the message is conceptual, not verbal, then different people can translate it differently without the story breaking. One person hears, "Raise your vibration." Another hears, "Be less afraid." Another hears, "Stop giving attention to manipulation." And all can be presented as the same message expressed through different minds. Telepathy becomes an explanation for diversity without conceding error. Telepathy also functions as a moral filter. Spoken language can be challenged. A telepathic message, if interpreted as a direct imprint, feels more intimate and more authoritative. It bypasses the normal skepticism we apply to external speech because it arrives already inside the self. This is why many witnesses describe it as undeniable. They interpret the certainty as proof of the source. But certainty is not proof of externality. Certainty is a psychological state, and it can be produced by many conditions: trauma, altered states, intense emotion, social priming, or deep meditative absorption. The experience can be authentic and still not settle the question of what caused it. A second mechanism is the download. The term is modern, technological, and revealing. It frames the mind as hardware receiving packets of information. In many Blue Avian stories, a download is not a single sentence, but a sudden knowing, a bundle of insights, sometimes accompanied by a bodily sensation, pressure in the head, tingling, a wave of calm, or a sense of being filled with understanding. Downloads are especially useful to the narrative because they can include large amounts of content without needing to be spoken or tested. A witness can claim to have received complex knowledge while remaining unable to articulate it fully. The inability to articulate becomes part of the mystique rather than a weakness. Downloads also help resolve a recurring tension. Why would advanced beings communicate in vague spiritual language rather than concrete detail? The answer becomes that the detail is transmitted, but the human receiver cannot fully translate it into words. This preserves the being's supposed sophistication while explaining why the content remains frustratingly non-specific to outside listeners. It also creates a gap that can be filled by interpretation, which is where communities and influencers gain power. A third mechanism is dreaming. Dream contact is common because dreams offer a built-in explanation for why encounters are private, symbolic, and resistant to evidence. A dream can contain beings, settings, and messages without requiring physical logistics. It also offers the witness a deep sense of intimacy. In many accounts, the dream is described as different from ordinary dreaming, more vivid, more coherent, with a memory that persists. This distinction is important to believers. It marks the experience as real contact, not random subconscious imagery. But from an investigative standpoint, dream contact is almost impossible to separate from expectation effects. Once a person is immersed in Blue Avian lore, the imagery becomes available to the mind. The mind then has raw materials to build dreams that feel aligned with the narrative. This does not mean the dream is fake or meaningless. Dreams can be psychologically meaningful. They can deliver insight. They can reshape a life. The point is that dreams cannot, by themselves, establish an external entity because the dream environment is generated internally, and the boundary between internal and external is exactly what is under dispute. A fourth mechanism is meditation or trance. Here, the Blue Avians often appear as presences encountered in a calm state, sometimes with a sense of light or a feeling of being observed. The witness may describe entering a mental quiet and then receiving a message. Meditation is a plausible context for profound subjective experiences. It can change perception and emotional processing. It can also produce vivid imagery, especially when practiced with intent. In many communities, people meditate specifically to initiate contact. That intention shapes perception. Again, this does not invalidate the experience. It simply means the experience is not inherently diagnostic of an external source. The fifth mechanism, less emphasized in Blue Avian-specific lore, but present in adjacent narratives, involves altered states through stress, sleep paralysis, or dissociation, moments where the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes unstable. These states can produce the sense of a presence in the room, auditory impressions, visual anomalies, and intense fear or calm. People may interpret these events through the most available narrative template. In a Blue Avian context, a presence that feels calm may be interpreted as a benevolent visitor. A presence that feels invasive may be interpreted as an adversarial faction. The same neurological phenomena can be mapped onto the factional cosmology in a way that makes the cosmology feel confirmed. These mechanisms share a key feature. They generate high conviction while producing low public auditability. This is why Blue Avian lore spreads as a belief ecology rather than a documented case file. It is built on a form of evidence that persuades the individual directly and cannot be transferred cleanly to others. You can describe the experience, but you cannot deliver it as a verifiable artifact. The listener is asked to trust the witness. Trust becomes the currency. And once trust becomes the currency, social dynamics take over. Private revelation creates authority hierarchies. If contact is internal and unverifiable, then the people who claim contact become privileged sources. Their status rises because they have access to direct information. Others who want certainty cluster around them. This produces a familiar structure: interpreters, followers, factions, disputes over who is genuine, and endless arguments about discernment. The narrative itself often warns against deception and ego, but the communication mechanism practically guarantees that the community will struggle with deception and ego because there is no external scoreboard. This is where the Blue Avian message about sovereignty becomes both essential and paradoxical. Many retellings insist that the beings encourage independence. Do not worship. Do not surrender your judgment. Do not hand your power to gurus. But the system's mechanics reward the opposite behavior. People who feel anxious seek certainty. Certainty is offered by confident messengers. The more confident the messenger, the more followers they attract. Over time, the movement can become dominated by those who speak with absolute assurance, even if the supposed guardians discourage absolute authority. A second social effect is narrative convergence. In communities built around private revelation, people learn the expected vocabulary. They learn the themes: free will, fear manipulation, non-interference, higher ethics. They learn the imagery: blue beings, councils, spheres, factions. When they later have experiences, dreams, meditative visions, emotional breakthroughs, they interpret them in that vocabulary. Their reports begin to sound similar. The similarity is then treated as corroboration, but similarity can be produced by shared culture as easily as by shared external reality. A third effect is immunity to correction. In public domains, claims can be corrected by evidence. In private revelation domains, correction threatens identity. If someone's contact story is a cornerstone of their meaning, then challenging it can feel like attacking their life structure. Communities therefore develop protective norms. Do not invalidate experiences, honor all journeys, trust intuition over skepticism. These norms can be compassionate. They can also disable critical thinking. A healthy community can respect experiences while still distinguishing between personal meaning and public fact. Many belief ecosystems struggle to maintain that boundary. The epistemological problem becomes clearer if you ask a simple question: what would it take to tell the difference between genuine external contact and internally generated experience? If the beings communicate through concepts, dreams, and impressions, then almost any content can be attributed to them. If contradictions appear, they can be explained as translation errors or factional interference. If predictions fail, timelines can be blamed. If evidence is absent, free will can be invoked. The system becomes highly adaptive. High adaptability is not a sign of truth, it is a sign of survivability. This does not mean nothing is happening. It means that, by design, the claim cannot be settled by ordinary means unless it produces outputs that break out of privacy. Outputs could include specific, independently verifiable information, unknown to the receiver at the time, consistent predictions with precise details, or shared encounters with multiple independent witnesses who document the same event contemporaneously. In Blue Avian lore, such outputs are rare or disputed. Instead, the outputs are moral: calmer behavior, reduced fear, increased compassion, a sense of purpose. These are valuable, but they do not prove an external species. At this point, the most disciplined stance is to treat the contact claims as two things simultaneously: psychologically real experiences that can shape lives, and epistemically weak foundations for public factual assertions. That dual stance allows respect without surrender. It avoids the cruelty of dismissing people's inner experiences as trivial, and it avoids the recklessness of treating inner experiences as evidence of external beings. The crucial next step is to examine what the message demands. If the Blue Avians are primarily moral teachers, then the content of the message matters more than the creature design. What ethics do they promote? What behaviors do they encourage? What fears do they activate? What social structures do their messages create in communities? These questions are not abstract. They determine whether the phenomenon, regardless of literal truth, produces healthier humans or more vulnerable ones. The ethical core, free will, non-interference, and the contradictions. At the center of Blue Avian lore is an ethical claim. The universe is not morally indifferent. It is governed, at least in part, by principles: free will, developmental sovereignty, and non-interference. The Blue Avians are often framed as enforcers or exemplars of these principles. They do not conquer, they do not openly rule. They guide with restraint. They refuse to provide proof that would force belief. They emphasize inner sovereignty. If this were the entire story, it would function less like an alien report and more like a moral parable. But the moment you treat it as a description of real actors operating in a real environment, contradictions emerge. Those contradictions are not incidental. They are the pressure points that reveal what the narrative is built to accomplish. Begin with free will. In these narratives, free will is the cosmic value that justifies almost everything: why Earth is not openly contacted, why suffering persists, why evidence is scarce, why intervention is limited. The claim is that overt proof would coerce humanity into a belief state, and coerced belief would violate the integrity of choice. Therefore, the beings communicate subtly, allowing individuals to accept or reject. On the surface, this is coherent. It positions the Blue Avians as ethical and avoids the image of benevolent tyranny. But free will becomes complicated the moment you consider how influence actually works. Human decisions are shaped by environment, education, culture, propaganda, trauma, and incentives. If a non-human intelligence can influence your mind telepathically, that influence is far more direct than any speech. A telepathic download does not just offer information, it can shape emotion, certainty, and orientation. In that sense, private revelation can be more coercive than public evidence. Public evidence can be debated by everyone. Private revelation creates an asymmetry. One person receives a message that feels undeniably true, and then becomes an authority to others. That can reduce the free will of the community because followers are asked to trust the receiver. Blue Avian lore anticipates this and often insists that the beings discourage worship and authority. The message is typically, do not follow gurus, follow your own discernment. Yet the mechanism of contact produces gurus anyway. Any worldview that privileges private revelation over public verification creates a market for interpreters. The beings can discourage worship, but the social dynamics remain. This is the first core contradiction. A myth built to protect free will often generates structures that pressure belief. Then there is non-interference. Blue Avian stories frequently emphasize that advanced beings avoid interfering with developing civilizations. Earth must evolve through its own choices. Open intervention would stunt growth, like solving a child's problems for them. Again, this is coherent as a moral stance. It frames guardianship as restraint rather than control. But non-interference contradicts contact itself. If the beings appear to individuals, deliver messages, warn of manipulation, and steer attention, they are interfering. The lore resolves this by distinguishing between guidance and interference, usually by claiming that guidance preserves choice because it can be ignored. Yet guidance is still influence. If a being warns you of deception and frames certain choices as spiritually aligned, it is shaping your moral landscape. The difference between interference and guidance becomes a semantic line that shifts depending on what the story needs to justify. This contradiction becomes sharper when the narrative includes antagonists. If predatory factions are manipulating humanity and the Blue Avians know it, then non-interference becomes ethically strained. Imagine a guardian who refuses to stop a predator because stopping would violate the victim's autonomy. That is not a coherent moral position in human terms. The story solves this by invoking higher law. Intervention is restricted, but extreme violations are prevented. Or by invoking consent. Predators can only influence humans if humans invite it through fear or agreements. This transforms the ethical problem into a metaphysical contract problem, but it introduces a hazard. It can imply that victims consented at some level, which can become a spiritualized form of victim blaming. The third principle is truth without coercion. Many Blue Avian narratives claim that disclosure must occur gradually, so humans are not destabilized. The beings will not land publicly because it would break society. They will not provide proof because it would force belief. This is framed as compassion, but it creates a strategic dilemma. If the beings can prevent destabilization, they presumably have enough influence to guide a soft landing into new reality. If they cannot, then their restraint may not be ethical. It may be impotence disguised as principle. The narrative usually chooses the first. The beings are powerful, but constrained by ethics. Yet power constrained by ethics must still produce coherent outcomes. In practice, the outcomes remain ambiguous, which again pushes the claim into unfalsifiability. A fourth ethical axis is fear. Blue Avian lore often insists that fear is the primary lever of manipulation. The remedy is to reduce fear, withdraw attention from panic cycles, and cultivate compassion. This message can be psychologically useful. It can help people regulate their nervous systems and resist outrage addiction. But it also creates a subtle paradox. If fear is the enemy's fuel, then the story must be careful not to generate fear. Yet many Blue Avian ecosystems are saturated with fear-based content about predators, infiltration, and impending catastrophes. The cure is packaged with the disease. This leads to the most important practical test. What is the net emotional effect on the believer? If exposure to the narrative reduces fear and increases agency, the ethical claim has value regardless of literal truth. If exposure increases suspicion, isolation, and hypervigilance, the narrative is functioning as a fear engine while claiming to be a fear antidote. Blue Avian lore often presents itself as stabilizing. Communities built around it can become destabilized if the antagonist component dominates. Now consider the role of discernment, a term used constantly in these spaces. Discernment is presented as a skill, the ability to sense whether a message is aligned with truth or deception. On paper, this is a safeguard. It encourages personal responsibility. But discernment can also become an excuse to bypass evidence. If discernment is treated as a substitute for verification, then any belief can be justified by claiming it feels true. The community then becomes divided by competing intuitions, and the loudest or most charismatic intuition wins. This is where the false light concept appears in some adjacent narratives. The idea that not all benevolent-seeming messages are benevolent. Predatory forces can masquerade as teachers. Blue Avian lore sometimes positions the Blue Avians as the true benevolent force, warning against false light. But once false light becomes a common accusation, it becomes a weapon inside the community. If someone disagrees, they can be labeled deceived. If a channeler delivers a conflicting message, they can be labeled infiltrated. The belief system that aims to protect people from manipulation can itself become a manipulation toolkit because it allows social control through moral labeling. The core contradiction can be summarized simply. A worldview that claims to defend sovereignty can create new dependencies. The narrative claims, do not fear, do not worship, do not surrender your agency. The community dynamics can become fear the manipulators, trust the insiders, follow the updates, align with the right faction. The ethical content is noble. The social implementation can drift. At this point, it becomes necessary to ask why the ethical principles are framed the way they are. Free will and non-interference are not just cosmic rules. They are narrative instruments that solve human psychological problems. They explain why the world is not fixed from above. They prevent the believer from having to confront the possibility that there is no guardian. They also prevent the skeptic from demanding public proof. In other words, the ethical rules perform a double role. They provide moral meaning, and they protect the narrative from falsification. That protection is not necessarily intentional deception. It can be an emergent property of how myths evolve. There is one more contradiction that deserves attention. Selection. If the Blue Avians communicate privately to preserve free will, why choose certain individuals? Why not choose randomly? Why not communicate equally? The lore often answers that contact occurs based on readiness. People who have cultivated a certain consciousness can perceive them. This preserves the being's ethics while explaining selectivity, but it also creates a spiritual hierarchy. Some are ready, others are asleep. This hierarchy can become a social caste system inside the community. Those who claim contact become high vibration, and those who doubt become lower. A rule meant to preserve free will becomes a mechanism for status. And yet, despite these contradictions, the ethical core has one undeniable power. It externalizes a moral ideal. It places compassion, calmness, and sovereignty into the mouth of a higher intelligence. For many people, that gives the ideals weight. It feels like cosmic endorsement. This may be the deepest function of the Blue Avian myth, to authorize a particular moral orientation in an era where many institutions feel morally bankrupt. If that is the function, then the next question is not only is it true, but what does it do? What behaviors does it produce? What relationships does it improve or damage? What vulnerabilities does it create? To answer, we have to leave the ethical principles and examine the community and marketplace structures that form around them. The myth does not live in a vacuum. It lives in podcasts, paid communities, conferences, content economies, and identity formation, sociological reality, community, status, and the marketplace of mysteries. By the time a person encounters the Blue Avians as a coherent concept, guardians, councils, non-interference, fear manipulation, they are rarely encountering a single claim. They are encountering a social world. The phenomenon is not only a set of stories, it is an ecosystem of people, channels, rituals, vocabulary, and status markers. This is where the Blue Avians become measurable, not through physical artifacts, but through the patterns of community behavior that form around the narrative. The first sociological function is belonging. Blue Avian lore offers more than information. It offers membership in a group that considers itself awake in a world perceived as asleep. That membership can be deeply attractive. It provides a shared language to describe alienation, distrust of institutions, and a hunger for meaning. It provides the comfort of a map. This is why the world feels manipulated. This is why you feel different. This is why the mainstream dismisses you. Once someone accepts that map, the community becomes a refuge. The myth is not just about extraterrestrials, it is about finding one's people. Belonging has an inevitable companion, boundary maintenance. A group survives by defining what counts as inside and what counts as outside. Blue Avian communities often maintain boundaries through terms like discernment, programming, low vibration, and fear-based thinking. These terms can be used responsibly as reminders to avoid panic and to think independently. They can also become social weapons. If someone questions a claim, they can be told they are not ready. If someone challenges a leader, they can be told they are deceived. If someone leaves, they can be framed as having fallen back asleep. In this way, spiritual language becomes a soft enforcement system, not police, but pressure. The second function is identity formation. Blue Avian narratives allow individuals to transform their sense of self from passive consumer of events to active participant in a cosmic drama. I am not just watching history, I am resisting manipulation through consciousness. This identity can be empowering, it can also become brittle. When a person's identity is fused to a worldview, criticism of the worldview feels like criticism of the person. Debate becomes personal threat. At that point, the narrative is no longer evaluated, it is defended. The third function is status. In communities built on private revelation, status tends to attach to proximity to the unseen. Those who claim contact through dreams, downloads, or channeling occupy a higher rung. Those who produce insider details, factions, councils, timelines, rise further. Those who can interpret the chaos with confidence become central nodes. Status is reinforced by audience attention, likes, shares, invitations to podcasts, paid memberships. Over time, the ecosystem can replicate the very hierarchies it claims to oppose. The myth says sovereignty matters, the social structure rewards followers. This leads directly to the marketplace problem. In the modern attention economy, compelling metaphysical content is monetizable. Monetization can be explicit: subscriptions, private groups, courses, paid readings, conference tickets, exclusive briefings. It can also be indirect: ad revenue, sponsorships, brand building, consulting. None of this automatically invalidates a person's sincerity. People can believe what they say and still earn money. The issue is incentive alignment. When an audience pays for updates, the creator is rewarded for producing updates. When an audience pays for urgency, the creator is rewarded for urgency. A stable, modest narrative is not rewarded as strongly as a narrative that escalates stakes and introduces new revelations. This is why myth ecosystems tend to expand. New factions appear, new cosmic deadlines are suggested, new warnings circulate. The content must keep moving because stillness is death in an algorithmic environment. Platforms reward frequency and engagement. Engagement is often highest when content triggers emotion, especially outrage and fear. Blue Avian lore claims to reduce fear, but the broader ecosystem it lives in rewards fear-based engagement. This is a structural contradiction. The stated mission and the platform incentives pull in opposite directions. Even well-intentioned creators can drift toward sensationalism because the system silently trains them. Another market dynamic is the premium on exclusivity. If the truth is available to everyone for free, there is limited leverage for paid access. But if the truth is hidden, fragmented, and dangerous, then access becomes valuable. This is where insider framing becomes economically potent. A creator can imply they have sources, that they are in contact, that they receive updates others don't. The audience receives not only information, but the feeling of being protected by proximity to someone in the know. Protection is one of the oldest products in human history. In belief ecosystems, it can be sold without a physical good. The fifth function is narrative governance. When communities develop strong internal coherence, they begin to police story consistency. People argue about which factions are real, which messages are authentic, which channelers are compromised, which sources are false light. This produces factionalism, sometimes intense. Ironically, the more a community talks about resisting manipulation, the more it can fracture under suspicion of manipulation. This is not an accident. It is a predictable outcome of a system where verification is difficult. In the absence of evidence, trust becomes the main stabilizer, and trust is fragile. A related phenomenon is doctrinal hardening. A story starts as a loose set of impressions, then becomes a standardized cosmology. Terms become fixed, timelines become canonical, deviations become heresy. This hardening can be subtle. A community repeats certain themes until they become assumed truths. People then reinterpret their own experiences to match the assumed truths. The myth becomes a lens through which personal events are read. Over time, the lens becomes invisible. It feels like reality itself. This is how myth systems mature, by turning interpretation into perception. This has consequences for mental and emotional health. For some individuals, Blue Avian-oriented practices, meditation, reduced doom consumption, emphasis on compassion can be stabilizing. For others, immersion in factional cosmology and hidden enemy narratives can increase anxiety, sleep disruption, isolation, and obsessive pattern scanning. The same content can regulate one nervous system and dysregulate another. Community norms often complicate this. If fear is framed as feeding the enemy, members may hide anxiety rather than seek support. If skepticism is framed as programming, members may suppress healthy doubt. If leaving the group is framed as falling asleep, members may stay longer than is psychologically healthy. There is also a relational cost that appears in many high-belief ecosystems: estrangement. When a worldview divides people into awake and asleep, it can damage family and friendships. Conversations become tests. Disagreement becomes moral failure. Loved ones become controlled. The myth offers belonging inside the group, but can erode belonging outside it. This is one of the clearest markers of whether a belief ecosystem is functioning healthily. Does it widen a person's capacity for connection or narrow it into a single sanctioned community? The next layer is institutional substitution. Many people drawn to Blue Avian lore have experienced disappointment with mainstream institutions, government, media, religion, healthcare, education. The myth ecosystem offers an alternative authority structure. Instead of journalists, you have podcasters. Instead of clergy, you have channelers. Instead of peer review, you have discernment. Instead of public documents, you have private revelation. This substitution can feel liberating. It can also replicate the same problems: gatekeeping, dogma, and abuse of trust. This is why the phenomenon must be analyzed with a double lens. On one side, Blue Avian communities can be seen as modern spiritual communities responding to real social conditions: distrust, fragmentation, and the hunger for meaning. On the other side, they can be seen as vulnerable structures where unverifiable claims, charisma, and platform incentives can create exploitation. The truth is not one or the other. It depends on the specific group, leader, and participant. A disciplined way to evaluate the ecosystem is to ask what it makes people do. Does it make them kinder in daily life? Does it help them regulate their attention and emotions? Does it encourage constructive engagement with reality, health, relationships, work, grounded civic action? Or does it pull them into endless content consumption, social suspicion, and escalating interpretations of hidden warfare? A myth system that produces the first set of behaviors may be useful regardless of literal truth. A myth system that produces the second set may be harmful even if some of its critiques of society are accurate. At this stage, the Blue Avians are less important than what they represent. They represent a longing for ethical oversight in a world where power often appears unethical. They represent a desire for cosmic reassurance without the coercion associated with older religious structures. They represent a search for meaning that feels both spiritual and modern. In other words, the Blue Avians function as a cultural invention or cultural reception tailored to the psychological climate of the internet age. This sets up the final synthesis. Whether or not the Blue Avians exist as external entities, the story they carry reveals something concrete: how humans build cosmologies to survive uncertainty, how online economies turn meaning into content, and how a desire for sovereignty can produce new dependencies. The closing question is not only, are they real, but what does our need for them say about us? Final synthesis: what the Blue Avians reveal about us. The Blue Avians sit at a crossroads where modern UFO culture, spiritual hunger, and internet-era myth-making converge. If you treat them only as a literal claim, an actual extraterrestrial race with blue feathers and a defined agenda, you run into an immediate constraint. The story does not rest on public, verifiable evidence. It rests on testimony, private revelation, and a cultural feedback loop that amplifies coherence into certainty. If you treat them only as fiction, you miss what makes the phenomenon persistent. It is not merely entertainment. It is a living narrative that shapes identity, community, ethics, and fear. The most defensible approach is to treat Blue Avians as a phenomenon with two layers: the factual layer we cannot confirm publicly, and the functional layer we can observe in human behavior. On the factual layer, the Blue Avians remain an unresolved claim. The evidence most often offered, images without provenance, channeling transcripts, dreams, meditation encounters, anonymous insider confirmations, does not meet the standard of independent verification. This does not mean witnesses are lying. It means the claim cannot responsibly be elevated to public fact based on what is typically presented. In an honest accounting, the Blue Avians are unproven as external beings. But the functional layer is vivid. Blue Avian lore offers a moral architecture. Free will matters. Non-interference preserves sovereignty. Fear is a primary instrument of manipulation, and compassion is a form of resistance. It offers an explanation for why the world feels chaotic without requiring open alien invasion. Influence instead of occupation, attention capture instead of artillery. It offers a comforting counterweight to predatory alien archetypes, a benevolent faction that stabilizes the universe morally. In a period defined by institutional distrust and algorithmic polarization, this is an emotionally intelligent narrative package. It tells people the universe is not indifferent and that they are not helpless. It tells them the battlefield is attention and the weapon is emotional self-regulation. That alone explains much of the myth's appeal. People are not only looking for aliens, they are looking for coherence. They want to know why modern life feels like a machine designed to keep them anxious, distracted, and reactive. Even without metaphysics, the description matches reality: outrage economies, propaganda loops, and social incentives that reward division. Blue Avian lore translates these conditions into a cosmic story with heroes and villains. It grants moral clarity and a sense of participation. It tells the believer you can resist simply by refusing fear. This is where the story becomes both potentially beneficial and potentially dangerous. It is beneficial when it functions as a discipline of attention. If the message leads a person to consume less panic content, regulate their nervous system, and treat others with more patience, the effect is constructive. If it encourages humility and personal responsibility, do not worship, discern carefully, do not surrender your judgment, it can be a corrective to the worst instincts of conspiracy thinking. If it pushes people toward compassion without isolating them from reality, it can be a healthier alternative to nihilism. It is dangerous when it turns into a closed loop. The same narrative structure that protects the story from falsification can also protect it from correction. Free will can become a shield that explains away the absence of proof. Timeline divergence can become a shield that explains away failed predictions. Discernment can become a substitute for evidence rather than a supplement to it. And the antagonist architecture, manipulators, infiltration, fear harvesters, can turn everyday disagreement into spiritual warfare. A worldview designed to reduce fear can become a machine for producing fear, especially when platform incentives reward sensationalism. The deepest contradiction we traced is this: a myth that claims to defend sovereignty often generates dependence. Private revelation creates authority hierarchies. The need for interpretation creates guru dynamics. The warning against manipulation can become a tool for social control. Communities can fracture into factions accusing each other of deception. People can become isolated from friends and family who do not share the worldview. At that point, the story is no longer a guide, it is a gate. So what is the most responsible conclusion? If the question is, are the Blue Avians real? The only honest answer, based on the typical forms of evidence, is that we cannot confirm their external reality. There is no public dataset that forces assent. Claims remain largely untestable and often self-protecting against audit. If the question is, does the Blue Avian phenomenon matter? The answer is yes, because it reveals consistent truths about human meaning-making. It reveals that people crave moral structure when institutions feel untrustworthy. It reveals that the line between spirituality and conspiracy is often drawn by emotion: fear versus calm, paranoia versus compassion. It reveals that the internet can manufacture consensus around an image faster than it can establish facts. And it reveals that modern myths increasingly use technological metaphors, downloads, frequency, vibration, because those metaphors match the lived reality of an age where information feels like energy and attention feels like currency. The Blue Avians, in this sense, are a modern angel story wearing science fiction clothing. They are a messenger archetype for a secular world that still wants transcendence. They offer reassurance without demanding traditional religion. They offer cosmic ethics without requiring a church. They offer a narrative in which humanity is watched but not enslaved, guided but not coerced, threatened but not doomed. That is not a random invention. It is a story tailored to a culture exhausted by control systems and hungry for a version of hope that feels adult. The question then becomes how to engage such a phenomenon without being absorbed by it. A grounded engagement starts with a clear separation of categories. Personal experience can be honored without being converted into public fact. Private revelation can be meaningful without becoming authority over others. Moral guidance can be adopted without metaphysical certainty. In practice, that means asking simple, non-negotiable questions whenever a claim is presented. What is the source? Can it be independently verified? Does it make falsifiable predictions? What incentives exist for the messenger? What does the claim ask you to do? Does it expand your life or narrow it? Does it increase compassion or increase hostility? Does it reduce fear or monetize it? These questions do not require cynicism. They require discipline. And discipline is exactly what the Blue Avian message claims to teach: sovereignty of attention. Ironically, the most coherent way to honor the stated lesson is to apply it to the narrative itself. If the story demands constant vigilance and content consumption, it is violating its own principle. If it demands obedience to an interpreter, it is undermining sovereignty. If it produces paranoia, it is feeding the fear economy it claims to resist. There is also a constructive way to extract what is valuable from the myth without surrendering to it. If the story's ethical core is compassion, emotional regulation, and resistance to manipulation, those can be practiced regardless of whether Blue Avians exist. If the story motivates people to question outrage addiction, to repair relationships, and to reclaim attention from algorithms, it can function as a useful myth in the classical sense, a narrative that guides behavior. Myths do not need to be literally true to be socially powerful, but they become dangerous when they demand literal belief as the price of belonging. In the end, the Blue Avians are less a conclusion about the cosmos than a diagnostic about the present. They show what kind of universe people want to inhabit. One where power is restrained by ethics, where suffering is not meaningless, where manipulation can be resisted through inner discipline, and where benevolence exists even if it is quiet. They also show the risks of that desire. A hunger for moral certainty can become a vulnerability to storytellers who offer certainty in exchange for allegiance. The last and most sober point is this: the Blue Avians cannot be used as an escape hatch from human responsibility. Even if one imagines guardians and councils and cosmic laws, the world remains the world. People still suffer, systems still need reform, relationships still require work. The only disclosure that reliably changes life is the disclosure of how attention is captured and how fear is manufactured. If Blue Avian lore leads someone to reclaim attention and choose compassion, it has served a constructive role. If it leads someone to obsession, isolation, and escalating suspicion, it has become another mechanism of control. So the mystery remains intact, but the meaning is clear. The Blue Avians, whether external beings or internal archetypes, are a story about guardianship in an age of manipulation. They are a symbol of ethical oversight when earthly oversight feels broken, and they are a test of discernment, not of cosmic truth, but of human maturity, the ability to hold uncertainty without collapsing into either blind belief or reflexive dismissal. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.